I was listening to the news the other night, and the journalist told us we are entering into a new Cold War. Then he reassured us, but it's okay because we still have the doctrine of mutual assured destruction. I'm going to argue today that not only are we not entering into a new Cold War, we're entering into something much worse, similar to the period before World War I and World War II, and that the so-called doctrine of mutual assured destruction is dead. This means that major power war can be fought over different focal points, such as Crimea, eastern Ukraine, Taiwan. Others, many other points could spark a major power war. Only engaged UN diplomacy, coupled with bilateral and multilateral arms accords among the rival powers, will be able to prevent these regional conflicts from exploding into wider wars. At the same time, civil society needs to press their governments to engage in real diplomacy in order to change the world, in order to begin to resolve these regional conflicts and implement what I call regional peace and sustainable development communities. And I'll explain that in a minute. The international system is no longer bicentric. It's polycentric. At that time, the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union used their capabilities to keep potential challengers weak. They dominated. Didn't have the rise of China at that time. While at the same time, they tried to undermine each other's spheres of influences through proxy wars. Both sides tried to strain each other's economies by means of multi-trillion-dollar arms race in the hope that high defense spending would create domestic conflict. The more money you put into arms, the more problems you would have internally. Now, this system is no longer bipolar or bicentric, but polycentric. Now notice I don't like to use the term bipolarity or multipolarity or unipolarity, because that's neo-realist terminology. That terminology implies conflict. The term pole implies a conflict with another pole. So I've taken the term polycentric in order to imply that just because there are different centers of power doesn't mean they can't cooperate. They can collaborate, or they can go into conflict. But this is my point. The term polarity only comes into meaning when the system polarizes. The system polarized before World War I, and it's beginning to polarize now between two rival alliances. Alliance polarization is what must be averted if ongoing regional conflicts are not to lead to major power war. Now, one aspect of the domestic aspect of the Cold War is totally different. Just as the global political structure is polycentric, not bicentric, the political economic structure is not the same either. We can expect more domestic class, ethnic, and regional conflict plus acts of terrorism in the coming years due to the burgeoning extremes of wealth and lack of fair distribution of benefits and social status. In the US alone, since the height of the Cold War in 1978, CEO compensation has grown 940%, while the average worker compensation has risen only 12%. And more than 2,365 billionaires boosted their wealth by $4 trillion in just the first year of the pandemic. At the same time, new statistics show that the pandemic could push at least 55 to 63 million people into extreme poverty by the year of 2021 as GDP and per capita income declined in many developing countries, much lower than a decade ago. This shifting balance of wealth distribution augments the chances that domestic class and regional conflicts within states could spill over into the international arena through migration and through external state support for opposition movements inside the civil wars of rival powers. Then these domestic rebellions, conflicts can become interstate wars. Interstate wars become more likely when political elites seek to deflect attention from domestic socioeconomic and political problems by pointing at international threats, rather than seeking to engage in domestic reforms and full-fledged diplomacy with their external rivals. The global environmental crisis represents a sword of Damocles that has begun to wreak havoc, exacerbating social problems such as crop destruction and mass migration. Environmental crisis is augmenting tensions and disputes between states and regions whose infrastructure are primarily based on carbon, China, Russia, India, Iran, versus those states that are beginning to develop new green infrastructures, US, Europe, Japan. But even the latter most advanced economies and their allies are not transforming their carbon-based infrastructure fast enough into a more green infrastructure. And the very transformation, the transition to this new energy system and new infrastructure is creating crises as there are supply chain problems and higher costs in the transition, creating more domestic conflicts such as the Gilets jaunes here in France or some of the Trump movements in the United States. Furthermore, the fact that the U.S. Department of Defense is the single largest consumer of energy in the U.S. and the world's single largest institutional consumer of petroleum means that it will prove very difficult to reduce greenhouse gases without also reaching diplomatic rapprochement with Russia and China so as to reduce defense spending of the military-industrial complexes of the U.S., China, Russia, the Europeans, and others. In other words, it is crucial that the U.S. and EU pursue a truly engaged diplomacy in the effort to prevent an arms race with Russia and China that will concurrently prevent global warming and safeguard the environment. As I said, MAD is dead. It can be argued it never existed. The Cuban Missile Crisis came very close to the global war, nuclear war, as did the 1983 Able Archer crisis. The fact that the September 11, 2001 attacks came from the inside of the United States undermines the concept of MAD because the entire American nuclear arsenal did nothing to deter those attacks. Moreover, if we look at the international arms situation, major arms control agreements and arms inspections treaties are dead or dying. The Open Skies Agreement, the Conventional Arms Forces in Europe Treaty, which helped provide inspections of conventional and nuclear weapons, appear to be dead or dying. The 1987 INF Treaty, which had eliminated thousands of intermediate-range nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War, has been dumped, meaning that both the United States and Russia can begin to deploy such war-fighting weapons along with states such as China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, India, Pakistan. In Europe, the post-Cold War 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, in which Moscow acquiesced to NATO enlargement closer to Russian borders on the grounds that NATO promised not to deploy permanent troops or nuclear weapons, has broken down after the 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea and its political military interference and pressures on eastern Ukraine and Ukraine. This agreement is what justified NATO enlargement. The Russians are backlashing now, pressuring Ukraine in that regard. In the Indo-Pacific, the Cold War 1979 Taiwan Relations Act that defined U.S. and Chinese relations with respect to Taiwan appears nearly dead as China presses for unification by force as the U.S. appears to be increasingly supporting Taiwanese independence. Now, even though the Biden administration has wisely sought to save the New START Treaty and continue strategic talks with Moscow, and even though he's done the same thing with China for the first time in engaging in strategic talks with China, the panoply of new nuclear weapon systems and other missile systems need to be taken into account in the treaties. This means New START Treaty has to be either totally revised or it has to be other systems have to be added to it. Tactical nuclear weapons, for example, can theoretically make a limited nuclear war possible in certain regions, even if both sides can theoretically destroy each other. New hypersonic missiles can theoretically penetrate missile defenses. So these missile defense systems that were deployed in the 90s are useless. Furthermore, the tensions, the stealth, and the speed forces new weapon systems to be launched on warning. And this means that the launch on warning and the speed in which these weapon systems travel means that you have to need artificial intelligence to protect yourself, which means you're battling one supercomputer against another. In short, MAD is dead because attacks against major rivals can be waged by different means from inside the country, by acts of terrorism, by drone or cyber attack, without fear of nuclear retaliation. Tactical nuclear weapons could be used in peripheral areas. And because the mutual nuclear threat will no longer deter states from seizing or protected, coveted territories. The current alliance formation appears to be more like that before World War I or World War II than that of the Cold War. It's polycentric, more centers of power, and it's beginning to polarize into two rival systems of alliances. The U.S. is now pressing NATO and EU members, including Sweden and Finland, plus NATO and EU associates such as Ukraine, in Europe, as well as Japan, Australia, and India in the East, into a new coalition that's intended to counter the ambitions of a new Eurasian axis of Russia, Belarus, China, Iran, North Korea, and other actual and potential rivals. Now, what exacerbates the real possibility of major power war is not the so-called Thucydides trap, it's much talked about, in which a rising power, such as China, threatens to displace a major power from its achieved status as a regional or global hegemon, such as the United States. But it is also, there is a challenge for hegemony, but it's also the fear of threat of shifting alliances that help sustain or obtain the hegemony versus a rival state. The Thucydides trap does not explain why major power wars go global. The fear of alliance defection can lead major powers to take the risk to assert their interests by force against their rival. The fear of lesser powers that they will not be strongly backed by their major power ally can lead those lesser powers to use force preclusively so as to draw that major power ally or allies to their defense and financial support. In addition, when the system's polarized, a third party can set a match, as was the case for the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand in July 1914. 1 month of debate, discussion took place before the war broke out. Those peace talks resolved nothing because the system was already polarized between the German-led Triple Alliance and the French and British-led Triple Entente. Now, there is hope, believe it or not. War is not inevitable, but in order to prevent a major power war and arms race that could lead to major power war, what is needed is not merely arms control, arms reduction, and arms elimination talks, but peace accords that ameliorate geopolitical and economic conflicts. Arms treaties by themselves will not prevent war. What is needed is UN-backed diplomacy that seeks to resolve the significant geopolitical disputes between major and regional powers in key areas of the world by reaching peace accords, while likewise implementing systems of sustainable development for each region. This diplomacy means to move forward in every region of the world. Sustainable development communities can be developed in the Black Sea, in the South and East China Seas, in the Eastern Mediterranean, even in the Arctic. It means creating joint development projects with respect to energy, resources, fishing, and agriculture. It means pushing the diplomacy to show ways in which states, China and the U.S. can cooperate with regard to Taiwan. The U.S., Russia, Ukraine can all find ways to cooperate over the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. This is not utopian. At the end of the Cold War, UN-backed contact groups helped to resolve the conflicts in Cambodia to put an end to the killing fields and to prevent the Khmer Rouge from coming back to power. UN-backed contact groups also put an end to the conflict over Namibia between the Soviet Union and Cuba versus South Africa. UN contact groups also helped to put an end to the wars, the dirty wars in Central America, in America's own background. Now, it wasn't all perfect. There was no UN-backed contact group for Afghanistan, and that war lingered on. And look at the horrors it's created since then. Now, so it's time to revive these UN-backed contact groups as soon as possible, with civil society pressuring their governments to engage in full-fledged diplomacy, while concurrently drawing up plans for sustainable development communities. So, but how do we get there? How does Homo Geopoliticus begin to implement a worldwide system of interlinked regional peace and sustainable development communities in midst of the most dangerous arms race in the history of humanity, in the midst of major power threats and ongoing regional conflicts, and in the face of looming ecological catastrophe? With Russia massing troops around Ukraine, China flying nuclear-capable bombs over Taiwan, North Korea threatening a new nuclear arms race, Iran threatening to enrich uranium, ISIS threatening new terrorist attacks, what can be done? Given the immediate geopolitical dangers, the only option is to implement a new and more coordinated U.S. and European Union global strategy. UN-backed contact group that works with the U.S., EU, Russia, and China, among other states, is presently engaging in the quest to reach an accord over Iran's nuclear enrichment program. Obviously, a difficult and complex conflict that must be tackled by both multilateral and bilateral diplomacy. But other major regional disputes can also be tackled in the same way as I've just mentioned. The Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, East and South China Seas. Now, one of the ways to do this is to show the ways that these states can cooperate through sustainable development. But that's not sufficient. What's needed, at the same time we engage in UN-backed diplomacy, is tough, power-based bargaining, or brinkman and womanship. Let's get rid of that term, brinkmanship, to be able to reach diplomatic compromises with in these conflicts. Now, at the same time, the real danger, though, is that this multilateral bargaining process itself, the give and take, the promises of compromise and the rejection of those compromises that will go on, this is the real danger we face, because as we move towards peace discussions, it creates opportunities for more conflict. So the brinksmanship, brinksman and womanship, is what is needed in order to engage in real peace discussions. Thank you very much.